There's no doubt that we've made some progress in dealing with some extremist groups. For example, core al-Qaeda and bin Laden, that was based in the Fatah area between Pakistan and Afghanistan, that they have been greatly diminished. But what is also true is that in some ways the problem has metastasized. You have more regional terrorist organizations like a Boko Haram in Nigeria, espousing an extremist ideology, showing no regard for human life, and although they may not have the same transnational capacity that some of the earlier organizations did, they're doing great harm in Africa and in the Middle East and in South Asia. People always talk about the terrorist threat to the United States or the West, but the truth of the matter is that the number of people who are killed by terrorist attacks in African countries or in Muslim countries or in South Asia far outstrips any deaths that are experienced by Westerners. It's typically people right there where these organizations are based that are most likely to be killed. When the Kenya embassy bombing happened, the overwhelming majority of people who were killed were Kenyans, not Americans. And so this is not just a problem for us, this is a problem for everybody. Now the question is, how do we address this this problem? It is my strong belief that terrorism is more likely to emerge and take root where countries are not delivering for their people, and where there are sources of conflict and underlying frustrations that have not been adequately dealt with. The danger we have right now, for example, in a place like Somalia, is that it's been 2 generations, maybe 3, since there was a functioning government inside of Somalia. Now, we've started to see actually some progress, in part because of intervention by African nations in Somalia to clear the space, to create the space for governance. But you look at what's happening in Mali, for example, right now. Part of the problem is that you had a weak central government and democratic institutions that weren't reaching out as far into the country as were necessary. And we've got to build those institutions. A lot of what we talked about in terms of responsiveness and governance and democracy, those things become defense mechanisms against terrorism. They're the most important defense against terrorism. So I don't start with the attitude of a military solution to these problems. I think the more that we're giving people opportunity, the more that we're giving people education, the more that we're helping resolve conflicts through regular democratic processes, the less likely they are to take root. Now, having said that, there are some extremist groups that will not compromise or work through a democratic process. And we have to also be realistic about that. And what we want to do is partner with African countries to figure out how we can help. But I promise, this notion somehow that we want to somehow expand our military reach. I was elected to end a war. I've ended one. I'm now in the process of ending another one. Every few weeks, I go and visit soldiers who are your age, who've had their legs blown off in Afghanistan, or worse. Every week, I'm writing letters to the families of fallen soldiers. Sometimes I go to Arlington National Cemetery, where our heroes are buried, and I hug those families, and I feel their sobs on my shoulder. This idea somehow that, you know, we want to get more involved militarily around the world is simply not true. First of all, it costs a lot of money. And the United States, just like every country around the world, has to think about its budget. And where we intervene, oftentimes it's not very effective, because unless you've got a local population that is standing up against terrorism, we end up being viewed as interlopers and intruders. So in the Africa context, what we want to do is to build African capacity. You know, we want the African Union and other regional organizations to build up the capacity to send in peacekeepers, to be able to nip terrorist cells that may be forming before they start and gain strength. And we can provide advice and training, and in some cases equipment, but we would love nothing more than for Africa, collectively, to say no to extremism, say no to terrorism, to say no to sectarianism, which in the case of Boko Haram, for example, is an example of essentially a religious rationale for this kind of violence. And the United States to be able to step back and worry about selling iPads and planes. That's what we would like to do. But what we won't do is just stand by if our embassy is being attacked or our people are in vulnerable situations. And we expect countries to work with us to try to deal with some of these threats. And there's a global issue. It's not just one related to the United States. Okay. All right.
We have time to take one last question from Soweto.
If it's a really short question, I'll give a short answer and we'll get two in. Gentleman right here. Yes, go ahead. Everybody's got to, you got to describe why you're all wearing orange.
Okay, firstly, my name's Hein Dinkelman. I'm nervous. I'm a student at UJ, honest student. Also studied education. You said education people should stand up. My question is, we've got a lot of barriers in this country, and one of those barriers is the amount of students in our classes versus a single person. And what I find a difficult is, how does that one person stand up and control, in some cases, we've just come back from training, some cases 90 to 100 kids in one class. It's difficult enough to carry 40 in my class. How do you carry those 90? I find it very difficult, and try to make an impact in their lives.
Good. I think that's a great question. First of all, I think it's wonderful that you're going into education. Very proud of you. No job more important than educating our young people. This is a challenge that we have in the United States as well, and that is the issue of class size. Now, our problem typically is that our class sizes are around 35 or 33, and we'd like to see if we can get it down in the 20s. If you're talking about 90, that's a whole nother level. Now, I'm assuming we're talking about primary and secondary education. We're not talking about universities, because by the time you get to university, you better be focused on your studies. It's not the job of the teacher to make you do your work and pay attention, because you're now an adult. But when it comes to young people, studies do show that, particularly for poor children, the more one-on-one attention that they can get from their teachers, the more personalized instruction they can get, the better they're going to do. So the first response is, if you can budget, if a government can budget smaller class sizes, that's better. But not every country is going to have the resources to do that. And